We are talking today with Hans von Sponeck. Hans von Sponeck is a veteran of the United Nations and a former Assistant Secretary General. He joined the UN Development Program in 1968 and worked in Ghana, Turkey, Botswana, Pakistan, and India before becoming Director of European Affairs in Geneva. He was appointed the UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Iraq in October 1998. His responsibilities included direction of all UN operations in Iraq, managing the Oil for Food program, and verifying Iraqi compliance with it. He resigned his post in February 2000 to protest international policy towards Iraq. He has written numerous articles in German and English in professional journals and magazines on subjects of environment, social change, methodological conceptual alternatives in development, sanctions, and humanitarian exemptions. He is also the author of several books, including Human Development, Is There an Alternative? And more recently, A Different Kind of War, the UN Sanctions Regime in Iraq. Start out and tell us what brings you to Seattle.
Well, I have a constituency of friends here that invite me occasionally to report about my peace work. Since I left the United Nations in 2000, I have been quite active in Europe in particular, but not only, to try and inform people of what went wrong, why it went wrong as far as the United Nations and sanctions in Iraq are concerned, and what are the follow-up consequences. One can see a red thread going from the period of sanctions for the Iraqi people to the period of occupation in Iraq, and to debate this and to make sure that there is an information base that allows people to react to political decision-making. That is an objective that I've set, and I have a good, solid group of friends, as I said, here in Seattle, and it's good to be back. It's good to debate, and it's also good to reinvigorate myself, going back to Europe and say, hey, don't talk about America. America has many faces, and I see a very good face here in Seattle.
So one of your recent accomplishments, I believe, is you've been working on a peace plan for Iraq. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I'm a member of a small group of individuals that are part of a board of a Swedish peace organization. On that board is someone who lives in Australia, someone who lives in Palestine, a British girl. The founder of the foundation lives in Sweden, myself and a couple of other people. We decided that while we recognize the importance of political accountability and looking back and trying to bring to justice those who have brought so much suffering onto the Iraqi people, Iraqis like Saddam Hussein, but also international figures, our leaders, it is very important that after these many years of carnage and turmoil, that one must begin, even though it looks so inappropriate at this time of conflict to talk about peace. I think we feel that time has come to put time in and energy into this question of what kind of bricks must we define, must we produce in order to construct a house of peace in Iraq, with Iraq, however you want to call it. And we say that with a good bit of humility, because it is first and foremost for the Iraqis to construct that house of peace for themselves again. But they need massive, compassionate, constructive, without any hidden agenda, support from outside. And so we sat together in August last year in Lund, in southern Sweden, and we came up with an outline of what could eventually become a peace plan. And the peace plan includes, of course, has to include a demand for the withdrawal of foreign forces, foreign mercenaries, a closure of the bases, a reduction of an unacceptably large, dominating U.S. embassy in Baghdad. These are very fundamental positions we take. But if we left it at that, it would be we would create a very serious situation for the Iraqis, because it cannot be now a withdraw and forget policy. It has to be a withdraw and immediately coming into the vacuum that would develop if the troops left behind an Iraq and tell the Iraqis, now it's up to you to conduct your business. That would create very serious civil conditions, and we certainly don't want to do anything in this proposal to aggravate the serious situation that already exists. So fundamental position is troops out, and in must come peacekeepers. Income must be a force without, that is so important, a hidden agenda. They must just come in order to create a buffer between forces that have developed as a result of this illegal invasion into Iraq in 2003 that are now fighting each other. The sectarian conflict that has arisen is a direct outcome of the invasion and the occupation. We cannot wish that away. So we are trying to make a case, a multifaceted approach of moving into the vacuum that would develop were the troops to leave without any further in international and external action to ensure that there are ways in which the Iraqis can be helped to not get into a deepening conflict that could easily be the case if it was just troops out and nothing else. So we are making a very strong case also for people-to-people cooperation. This is a good moment where the international community, wherever well-meaning people are located, to show signs of understanding, signs of compassion, signs of willingness to help. You can't go into Iraq now, even if you had the resources to do that. But there are virtual means also. You can go through the internet. You can convey messages through YouTube and all the other facilities that modern technology has created. And so we are arguing that one should not wait, that there should be signs, of course, signs from the government, but also signs from the people. We argue that the damage that has been done by governments cannot be undone by governments alone. People must contribute, civic organizations, NGOs, individuals. That's one aspect. Then we want to argue, as others have done. For example, there is a peace plan, as you know, from presidential candidate, former presidential candidate Kucinich. We associate ourselves with his thoughts, as we do with some of the proposals that have been made by George McGovern and Polk and others in America. We are certainly aware, and we recognize with great satisfaction that the very country that is so often criticized for having invaded Iraq also produces the people who are thinking about how to get out of this quagmire. And so we hope that some of the thoughts these people have here in America can dovetail into what we have tried in this Swedish initiative, which involves a wide range of other elements. Let me mention a couple. One is to argue that the new Iraq, the Iraq in the post-occupation period, cannot start its life with a huge debt burden. involving dubious debts that were incurred by a ruthless dictator, Saddam Hussein, and which benefited maybe Western and other companies, governments, and so on. So the initiative by former Secretary of State James Baker to go around countries that are creditors to Iraq and say, look at the money that you expect from Iraq, and discriminate between the dubious debts and the bona fide debts, and then waive the dubious ones, and if you can, waive even the good ones, so that the new Iraq doesn't start its existence in a very precarious manner, even if one keeps in mind that Iraq is the second largest owner of increasingly rare oil resources. 112 billion barrels of oil are supposed to still be in Iraqi soil, but that is not an argument to force the new Iraq to pay a high level of debt. So we think that part of the peace process has to be a clean start, where the defendable debts can be repaid and the rest is waived. And then a controversial issue. The controversial issue is compensation. Iraq, when it illegally, against any international rule, invaded Kuwait in 1990, the international community, the United Nations, the US, Great Britain, they were all justified in saying that cannot go without punishment. And Iraq must pay back for some of the damages that were incurred as a result of this invasion. So, to make a long story short, until 2004, Iraq had been forced to pay about $19 billion in international claims from individuals, from firms, and from governments, mainly the Kuwaiti government. Is it so unacceptable or surprising that now there is a demand that says, well, we were called to the till in 1990 and we paid for 13, 14 years compensation for something we shouldn't have done. But you came into our country, you invaded us, and you occupied us. And there were consequences, many consequences that cannot even be repaid with money, because you can't bring a dead person back to life. You cannot rehabilitate a young person who should have gone to school but didn't under sanctions and occupation. So, but still, we have a moral and a legal right to claim compensation now from the US, from Great Britain, from Italy, from Spain, and from many other countries that were supporting an illegal invasion and an occupation, and say, now it's payback time. We now want to also have our compensation. So part of a peace discussion must include the clarification on what kind of compensation rights does Iraq have. So that's another element. Then an intriguing, it was not our idea, but we happily included it in our thinking about a peace plan, is why not create an institution that has helped us in Europe in the years after the Second World War, and that is to create an organization for security and development. The OSCE in Europe is doing very well, is playing an important role in reconstruction, also in the former communist countries. And it was suggested that one should create a similar institution for the Middle East that would recognize the issues for the Middle East as a whole, and supervise the security developments and supervise reconstruction, national progress programs, the whole nation and region building efforts that are going on or should be going on in the Middle East. That is another idea that we happily support, as we do the establishment of a standing regional conference. It could be that, it could be something else, but something that is institutionalized and can oversee this multifaceted conflict resolution effort that has to go on. What people often do not understand is the conflicts in the Middle East of today can no longer be viewed in isolation. It isn't that you can take and put into one box the Palestinian conflict and to another box the Lebanese-Israeli conflict and in another box the Iranian conflict and Iraq in still another box. It doesn't work that way because one influences the other, and therefore it has to be seen in a holistic manner. And having said this, we, of course, in this Swedish initiative are totally opposed to the approach that the government of President Bush chose to reinvigorate a peace process for Palestine, for the Middle East in Annapolis. This was a totally wasteful, in fact, it was, in my view, a counterproductive effort. You invited selectively. You cherry-picked nations and groups to participate. And by doing that, you took the first negative step in creating conditions of peace in the Middle East. If one doesn't, and I say this also as a former United Nations official who learned the ropes as a young diplomat in the UN. I learned about dialogue. I learned about conflict resolution. This was the opposite what happened in Annapolis, because you left out people that should have had a chair around the table in Annapolis, and that is Hamas, whether we like it or not, a legally appointed government in Palestine. It should include, as much as we would dislike to interact as friends with Hezbollah, we have to take cognizance of the fact that they exist, that they are a political force, that they have something to do with the crisis. And we have no question, it was a Caesarean birth for the U.S. government to decide to include Syria in Annapolis. But there was nothing about Iran or about the Iraq resistance. The Iraq resistance should have a seat in any negotiations, any discussions about peace prospects in the Middle East. And when you do that, when that table has all the chairs that represent the different factions, then a peace process, in my view, has a much better chance. That is not blue-eyed. This is not naive. I think that is realpolitik. It is what should happen if, and that's a big if our agenda is really an agenda of peace rather than an agenda of perpetuating a conflict, of trying to buy allies. And it hasn't gone unnoticed at all in Europe that Annapolis was behind the curtain, something to build up an alliance against Iran rather than building a peace in the Middle East. And the $60 billion bribe that was offered there to Israel and to Sunni governments in the Gulf was a terrible thing to do and was counterproductive. If the U.S. government thinks that it wins real allies in the Middle East today with that kind of approach, it has to think again, because it doesn't work. It hasn't worked and it will not work. So I'm saying in a very long way something which, however, has to be recognized if we want to make peace with individual crisis areas in the Middle East and the Middle East as a whole. So that is an integral part of our thinking. And then I want to come back for a moment to this people-to-people cooperation. Because people-to-people, normal people in whatever walk of life, helping Iraq, reassuring Iraq, links up nicely with another thought which we have, which is to consider a truth and reconciliation initiative. Not a replica of the successful South African model. There were different circumstances. It was a very different scenario in Southern Africa, with the black majority clearly in the opposition. It cannot be compared to the Iraq's situation, but something which makes the point that that Iraqi groups have to come together and find the truth and try to reconcile their differences. And also Iraq as a nation of many different ethnic groups, to come together and reconcile and find the truth with regard to the international partners. So at two levels there can be a truth and reconciliation effort, and we think this must be part of an overall peace process. I could finally maybe say that all these different initiatives must never forget that the lead instrument in this orchestra has to be played by the Iraqis themselves. We must not be presumptuous. We must not think that we, once again, as so often, take a lead where others should really take the lead. So it should be the Iraqis to sort out their miserable affairs and come to some understanding about how they want to live in the future, whether they want to have a federated state of Iraq or whether they want to have a different national entity. But whatever it is, we must have the humility to let them play the first fiddle. And we come in support without a hidden agenda, and maybe then there's a beginning. Really, my very last point would be that those in Europe and those in the US who have thought about what has to be part of a peace process, they should get together. And there is a New York-based institution, a small but very effective watchdog on affairs in the Middle East, particularly Iraq, called the Global Policy Forum. And the Global Policy Forum, led by an experienced person, Jim Paul, is maybe a venue for bringing different parties together from Europe and from the US to sit down and say, well, we all have thought about peace for Iraq. Let us now pool our resources, come up with a refined proposal that could be an input into what essentially has to be an Iraqi initiative. Thank you.
Do you feel your peace proposal, the 10-point peace plan, the audience of that is really for Western nations, so that since it's the U.S. primarily that is engaged in this war, that it is the mechanism that will allow the U.S. to begin this process, and at some point the Iraqis would jump in and say, okay, that's good, we like your plan, but we'll take over from here?
I would tend to think so, but I'm also aware that these initiatives, as so often, initiatives by the international peace movement, will in the beginning be wiped off the table by the political powers of the day and say this is well, you would use maybe the word hogwash. This is rubbish. This is not realistic. This is not doable. But it is a reflection of the public conscience, and that makes it important. There are so many people in this country, in your country, in America, that have an identity of concern and views to the many other people around the world, not just in Europe, but elsewhere, in Asia, in Africa, that also are thinking about this. And so it is it's a sign to the governments that people are astute, people are alert, people want to see that rhetoric, the good rhetoric that exists in the UN Charter, in the many good statements that one hears around the world from leaders, that rhetoric is translated into action. And from that point of view, I would hope that the powers of the day, the foreign ministers, whether they are in Washington, London, Stockholm, or wherever, respect people's voice, that they respect the fact that people take time out in order to voice their concern, and that they do what Secretary General Kofi Annan has referred to as the need to produce the glue of common interest, the glue of common interest between civil society and governments. The way we have gone about in conducting our Western foreign policy has led us into deep trouble. New alliances are mushrooming against it. The Western one-way street is no longer the accepted avenue on which people want to travel. We must recognize that, if not for ethical, then at least for pragmatic reasons.
How can people find out more about your proposal?
Well, one thing they can easily do, it's a very simple website address. It is www.transnational.org. When they click in on that website, they will see immediately references to the Middle East, to the peace plan for Iraq, who is involved. One prominent person, prominent for different reasons from the United States, is Dr. Richard Falk, former professor in Princeton, who is also an associate of the TransNational Foundation that produced this initial thinking. And it is fascinating for me to note that a few days ago, only a few days ago, the United Nations Human Rights Council appointed Dr. Richard Falk as the new UN rapporteur on Palestine. So he will play a good role, and he can also contribute to making people around the world realize that what I said in the beginning, that America has many faces, and his is an important face for change.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thank you.